Going to be showing you today is how to make a game in Microsoft MakeCode Arcade using the Python editor. The type of game we're going to make today is a maze game in the style of Pac-Man, and we're going to look at how you use the Python editor instead of the traditional blocks that you may have used in the past. Now, one nice thing about MakeCode Arcade is that it still essentially gives you blocks for all of these different commands. So you don't have to worry about just knowing the code off the top of your head. It is a good way to learn how Python code works and functions. And the first thing we're going to do in our game is, well, I've gone down a line. That is just my preference, so that I've got a nice empty line at the top that I can always copy stuff into. You don't have to do that, but it makes no difference to your code if you do have a blank line above you. And we can drag in our blocks into these lines and they fill out as code. So the first thing we're going to do is go down to scene and add a background for our game here, because currently it's very black and boring and not a very fun game to play. So we're going to set ourselves a background. You can either set a color or an image. I'm going to set an image for my background, and I'm going to drag this block in and pop it in here. You can see it very quickly fills out with all of these dots. It looks a right mess in our code. Now, what these dots are is pixels for the image. Now, we don't have to fill in our pixel values individually. That would take far too long. Instead, we can click this little palette that pops up on the left. We click that palette, and in our editor we can either draw ourselves a picture if you're good at art, or you can just click on the gallery and choose one of the pre-made backgrounds, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to choose the space one because I'm a physicist and I like some space. And once we've got this, we can either edit it. There's the fill tool. We can make things look a bit different if we'd like. Or we can just click done and leave. I would recommend, though, giving it a name first. The benefit of naming all your assets is that they then save to your assets tab. You can see if I click on my assets, I now have this pink moon saved as an asset. So if I make any changes to that image, I can quickly call upon it again. Whereas if I made any changes and then deleted this line of code, everything I had done would be lost. And nobody likes losing all of their hard work, so I recommend you give a name to everything you use. And then I'm going to click enter on my keyboard to give myself a new line and go back into scene to grab myself a tile map. If we scroll down, there's a category called tile maps, and we are going to drag in this first block, set tile map to tile map. I'm going to drag this in and pop it on line 3, and then this is waiting for us to import a tile map. As you can see, it's talking to the tiles class of objects, and it is telling it to use the function set current tile map to whatever is in these brackets. If you've ever played a platformer style game, you know that these tiles are what are actually your level. Like in Mario, you've got the little platforms to run and jump over. The background is not part of your game. It is something far off in the background that you can never reach, and it just stays static throughout the entire game. Your level is your tile map. So we're going to click back on this, and then we're going to build ourselves a maze. So to do this, I'm going to use 3 different styles of block. I'm going to use my blue block here to just create a border around my maze. So I'm going to use the square option here to click a border, drag it across, and complete my the border of my maze. Then after that, I'm going to have to choose two separate blocks, different styles of blocks, to be the entrance and exit to my maze. So I might choose this light grey one as my exit, and this darker grey as the entrance to my maze. And then once I've done that, I can go back to my blue blocks, wherever they were, and start building the walls of my maze. Okay, so you can build these walls however you want. There's no right way to do it, but just build them out so that you've got a path through your maze with an entrance and an exit. It's completed. And now the most important thing to check is that you can get from one end of your maze all the way around to the other end without running into a wall. Otherwise, your maze becomes impassable, and that's not a completable level for your game. But once you are sure that that does work, then you can go ahead and save on that maze and click Done. Okay, so now if we click play, we have a tile map, our maze, and our background. Now we just have to make a character that can fit inside of it. So we're going to find that under sprites. I'll make myself a new line, click on sprites, and right at the top of sprites, there's this create palette and create sprite image of kind. I'm going to drag that in and pop it on line 4. And this creates a nice blank map again. Yes, we know these dots are representing the pixels in our sprite. And you can see that this piece of code is saying to create a variable called mySprite and set it to the class of sprite. And in that class, it's going to create an image, create a sprite with this image. And the kind of sprite it creates will be a player. Now, there's many kinds of sprites we could have. We could have enemies or projectiles or collectibles or anything you can imagine. You can create your own classes for this as well. But we're setting the class to a player sprite, which is one that we can control as the player. So once again, we click on this little palette, and this takes us again into another editing screen. We can either create our own sprite, or you already know that I'm going to go to gallery and choose a sprite myself. So I'm going to choose, what do we want in space? This little space snake I'm going to have. I'm going to choose my space snake. I'm going to call him Space Snake. And click Done. And then you can see this has also been renamed. So now we have 3 assets, our pink moon, our level 1, and our space snake. And under our assets tab, there the 3 of them are. So now our space snake appears on our tile map, but we can't move the space snake around because we haven't got any controls that allow us to do that. So we're going to find them under controller. If we click on controller, once again a nice easy block, it's the one at the top. We're going to move my sprite with buttons. So if we drag this in, that will allow us to control my sprite using buttons. But wait, nothing happens. That's because if we look at this code, it is saying to access the controller and access the move sprite function. But it's not moving anything in particular. We have to change this none to say my sprite. And it comes up with the name of any variables we have, so we can just click on that once we're typing, and that will autocomplete it to be my sprite if we wanted. So now we are talking about this sprite, and we can control it. But it's not trapped inside the tile map. Also, there's one other thing. If we maximize this a second and have a look at the size of our sprite, we can see that our sprite is just about the size of these blocks. It is almost perfectly the same size as a block, which is fine. That means our sprite can move through the maze, but it's not necessarily easy to do so, because you'd have to get your sprite perfectly in line every time you wanted to change direction. So it's a good idea to shrink the size of our sprite a bit. And we'll find that again under sprites, right at the bottom. There is a block that says set my sprite scale to 1 and anchor in the middle, which just means it will shrink from the middle, which won't make it look weird or anything. So we can drag in this set my sprite scale to 1 and pop it on the next line. Now we know it can't be 1 because 1 is the size it already is. If it was 0, then it would have no size, and that wouldn't make sense either. So it needs to be somewhere between 0 and 1. I know I only need to shrink it a little bit, so I'm going to go for 0.8. And there you go. You can see now our sprite is just slightly smaller and fits nicely between these blocks. Okay, so now we can move our sprite around. The only issue is we can move them anywhere we like on this tile map. It's not locked into position. Now, this can be fixed back under our tile map. If you've ever played games like Mario or Sonic, you know that there are some blocks which are fake blocks, and they look like things you can stand on, but then you fall through them because they're not actually solid. Or maybe you find a block that doesn't look like there's any tile there. It looks like empty space. You can walk straight through it, but there's actually an invisible wall. Now this is because in a tile map, the actual tiles and whether or not they're solid are separate properties. If we click this sort of half-built wall of Lego here, it'll turn red, and that allows us to place solid objects. And then we can drag over our tile map, making all of these blue tiles that I've created into solid walls. Map is complete. Now, if you have accidentally gone over blocks you shouldn't have, such as your start block or the empty blocks between, while this is red, you can select the erase tool and you can erase these solid walls without erasing the tiles beneath them. So if you do accidentally go over, just use the erase tool to make sure only the walls that you want are actually solid walls. Once I've done this, I'll click done. And now if we test our game, our character is stuck between the blocks, which is exactly what we want. However, you may have noticed that when we started this, the character was actually on top of a wall, and while that's true, I can move about the walls freely, which isn't how we want it to work. So we need to get our character to start in the correct place, which is over here on this tile. We can find a block that does this under scene. So if we look under scene, there is a block that says place under tile map operations. You've got a block, place my sprite on top of location. So we can drag this in and pop it on line 7. And this now will place your sprite on top of whatever location you tell it to. However, we'll notice again, as was the same before for the controller, the thing you're placing isn't specified. So once again, this none needs to be changed to my sprite. And we need to know the location where we place it. If you look here, 0, 0 is the top left corner. So these are coordinates. We can find them out under tile map. If we look on our tile map, down the bottom, right here, next to the dimensions of our tile map, there are a set of coordinates. And as we move around, these coordinates change. Now, once we're on the tile map, it changes to 0, 0, 9, 1, 9, 2, 9, 2, 10. So we need to go up to our start block, which for me is 0, 1. And therefore, I can now click on Done and change this coordinate to 0, 1. If I try play now, my snake starts on the start block. Okay, so now we've got a snake that's on the start block. We can move them through the map, but the next problem is it goes off the map and you can't see where it goes. More than that, you can't see the rest of your maze. So we need to get the maze to move with the screen, or move across the screen. And to do this, we can get our camera to follow our sprite. This is also a block we find under Scene, under the section Camera. And the first block there is Camera Follow Sprite. If we drag this into a new line, then we're telling the scene to use the function Camera Follow Sprite. However, we don't want none, we want it to follow my sprite. And now, if we try, the camera moves with our sprite as it moves through the map. Okay, the only issue we have now is that when we get to the end, we don't know that we've gotten to the end. We need an end game. But to do that, we need to know that we're on this tile. Now, we found out how to place something on a tile, but not how to detect whether our character is on a tile. This is one of the reasons I've left a gap up the top. We're going to need a new function. Now we find this under tile maps. We've got run code on sprite of kind and overlaps tile at location, which is a lot of words to say that when a certain sprite lands on a certain tile, it runs this code. We can drag this in, but as you see, it looks slightly different. It's got this blue def at the start, which stands for definition. And this definition means that we're defining a new function. Now in Python, all of these functions that are defined have to be defined before your code starts running. So we're going to have to get rid of that. And instead, we're going to have to drag it in to the top. So this function goes right at the top of our code. And we're saying that when we overlap, we're defining a function called overlap tile for a certain sprite and location. And at the minute, we don't do anything when it happens. But then we check whether something triggers this function by seeing what sprite kind we have. So we have the player sprite, and this image is our tile. So we need to define which tile we're talking about. Now I know in my game I've used the light grey tile for the end game. So I can click on this palette, go to my gallery, and I've got to scroll all the way down and find the block I used, which is this one here, the light grey tile. So I can choose that and add it in. Now, when I get to the end, still nothing will happen at the moment, because while we've defined the tile, we're still not doing anything when this function is triggered. Under game, we can find our game over blocks, and we can set game over to be true. I'm going to get rid of this pass, because we don't just want to pass the function, we want to trigger game over to be true. Now when game over is true, that means we win. When game over is when game over is false, that means we lose. So we can try this and get this sprite all the way to the end of the game. And what should happen is it should trigger our game to be won. Fantastic. There's a few more things that we can do to make this game a little better. First of all, we can add ourselves an enemy. Now, an enemy is going to use almost identical code to our sprite. So instead of having to worry about dragging and dropping more blocks in, we can be proper programmers and just copy and paste our code. So I'm going to slide up here and copy everything up to my tiles. I don't want to change the tile map or the background. I just want all the stuff that talks about my sprite. I'm going to copy it, okay, or right click and copy it. I'm going to leave a line so we can see what we're doing and paste it here. Now let's have a look through this code and what we need. We need to create a sprite. We don't need to be able to control our sprite. So the controller function can be gotten rid of. We're going to need to set the scale of the sprite. We're going to need to place it on a certain tile, but we're not going to have the camera follow the enemy, so we can delete this too. Okay, now we need to give it a unique name. We can't be calling it my sprite, so we'll have to change this to my enemy. Same goes here. When we're talking about the scale, we're going to have to change the scale of my enemy. And when we place a sprite on a tile, we're going to want to be placing my enemy. Okay. The one other change we need to make here is to change the sprite kind to be sprite enemy. Sprite kind enemy. Okay, we're not talking about a player sprite anymore. And now we can choose an image for our sprite. So we'll go back to gallery and we want to pick something to be our enemy. I will choose the spooky space ghost. And I'm going to call him Space Ghost and done. And there we go. Now we've set a new sprite and we've set the scale, and if we play, we are getting an error. Getting an error on line 23. So it is good practice to know how you're dealing with them. I had a quick check of this error here, and the issue is coming. I seem to have moved past it now, but it's coming from the fact that Space Snake has disappeared. You can see there is still an object called Space Snake, but it doesn't actually exist anymore. So what I'm going to have to do is click here, back on to Space Snake, and just choose it again. Scroll down to wherever my snake was located, and choose him again. There we go. And now when I play, Space Snake should have returned to the game. Okay, and Space Snake is back in the game. A weird error there may have come from the fact that I copied and pasted over the sprite while making the enemy. But it was just from a sprite having disappeared from my code. There we go. So now we've got an enemy and our snake, but the problem is they appear in the same place and the enemy doesn't move. Okay, so we need, first of all, to set our enemy somewhere else. We can do this, as we know, on tile map. Let's find where we'd like our enemy to be. And I think maybe I'll add my enemy somewhere over here. So how about 8-1 on this platform over here? So I'll set him to 8-1. And under sprites, I will find the option to have my sprite follow. Here it is. Under physics, we find set my enemy follow my sprite. I can drag this in and place it there in a new line. And once again, we've got none, so we need to set which sprite we're following, which is my sprite. And now our enemy will try and follow us through the game. There we go, and he can catch us, but still nothing happens when he does catch us. So we need to add a new definition. And this definition is found under sprites. And under overlaps, under sprites, it says run code on sprite of kind overlaps other sprite of kind. Okay, so two different types of sprite overlapping will make this code run. Or we can be more specific and say if my sprite overlaps with a specific other sprite, then this code runs. So it depends if you wanted to add one enemy or more than one enemy into the game. I'm going to add this one in case we decided to add another enemy later on. And we know that this is a definition, so this is going to have to go at the top of our code. There's no reason you have to leave these gaps in your code, but it does make it easier to read and see what's going on. So we want to check if there's an overlap between sprite kind of player and sprite kind of enemy. And if these sprites do overlap, we want to say that game over, so I'm just going to copy this code from up here, that game over is now equal false, which means we lose the game. So if our sprites touch, we now end up losing. Okay, we can make this sprite follow us. We move through the level. You can see how far he gets, and we lose. Okay, so there we go. We have a game with a start and an ending and an enemy to follow us. The one last thing we could add to this game is a score and a way to keep track of score. Maybe we could have some collectibles as we move around the game screen. So to do this, we are going to add these collectibles into our tile map. So if we click on tile map, we can choose a kind of collectible. And we can find some either under miscellaneous or under dungeon. I'm going to add some of these red glowing orbs into the game. I might go with blue actually. And I'm going to place them every 2 tiles around the game, which is very much like Pac-Man. Okay, so there we go. We have a map full of collectibles. And we don't want these to be solid walls because we want to be able to move past them and collect them as we move. Now we are going to need another definition. A definition that states if we cross over these blue orbs, that we get points for it. So first thing we're going to need to do before we add our definition is to add a counter, and we can find this under info. So right at the top of info we have a score option, but we're going to choose set the score. So we're going to drag this in and place it right here, which remember is the top of our code. This is the top of our code because this is new definitions. This is where the code starts. And here we set our background, we set our tile map, and we're also setting our score, and we're setting it to 0. And then above this we can add a new definition. Now luckily we've already added a definition that talks about the tile map, and it's this one here right at the top. So we can copy this and paste it below. And we can see that what this is saying is when we overlap a tile. Now we've already got a function named overlap tile. We're setting the same function. We can't do that because then we overwrite what this function does. So we can change it to be when we overlap tile 2 if we wanted. We could change it to when we overlap collectible, which is a bit more accurate. But we just need to make sure that we are consistent with that naming. Now here we don't want to change the name of it because this is talking about a property within scene. Okay, we leave this one as it is. However, at the end of this, when it says sprite kind player, the particular image of the tile, and on overlap tile, we need to change this tile to also be collectible, because this is where it calls this function. So our new definition says on overlap of collectible of a certain sprite at a certain location. We run this code, and then we're checking it by saying within the scene, every time a tile is overlapped, we see what the player sprite is, we see what tile is under us, and we run the on overlap collectible if it's the right tile. Okay, so we need to set this particular tile as we did before. So we need to click the palette and look at our gallery and have a look for that blue orb that I just used. Obviously, if you used a different collectible, then you need to have a look for that in the code. And here it is, this little blue orb. And I'm going to click done. And now we're checking for that orb. By the way, as we're doing this, we could be naming these assets. I did say it was a good idea at the start. So it's probably a good idea for us to name them as we go along. So I could name this grey tile as well that I had before. And it will all work the same, it's just now they're specified within our code, which makes it easier for us to know what our code is doing. Okay, so we're checking if we're overlapping the blue orb, but we don't want to win the game if we overlap the blue orb. We want to add to our score, which is found under info. And under set score, we've got change score by 1, which is the block we will use. Now we'll notice as we move around, well, that's a problem. As soon as I sit on top of one of these orbs, I can rack up a practically infinite amount of points if I wanted to. Because I can just sit on top of it and the counter keeps raising. That's because we're never getting rid of these orbs. So there's one more thing we need to do to make this work. As well as changing our score, we need to remove the orb. And a block that can do that is found under Scene. If we scroll down in Scene, all the way to Tile Map Operations, we can set tile at location. If we drag this block in and pop it above our change score, then we can say that at a certain location, we set the tile we want. What we want to do is remove this line of code here, because we don't know the specific location of the tile we want to get rid of. We don't know its coordinates, but what we do know is that it's at whatever location our sprite is at. So we can just replace this with the word location, because it is going to take the location that is given to this definition. And that location is wherever our sprite has overlapped. So we can just change that to be location. And we still need to tell it what tile we're talking about. And what tile are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a blank tile. We can, if we want to call it transparent, but we just need to make sure that this is set to a blank tile. There is nothing there. We are setting it to be an empty tile now. Now if we try it, every time we hit one of these orbs, the orb disappears to a blank tile, and we only get a score of 1 for each orb we collect. We can move around the map and rack up as many of them as we can without our enemy seeing us. Okay guys, well I hope that gave you a brief introduction in how to program using Microsoft MakeCode. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing the games that you're able to make.